The desert sun scorched the valley of the winds, its rays striking the sand like punishment from a vengeful god. The caravan snaked forward, a procession of camels, baskets, and travelers, unaware that it had shed one of its own. Amunet, the daughter of a papyrus scribe, had fallen behind, first by a step, then by a breath, and finally, by a moment too long. Her sandal had come loose, and when she crouched to fix it, the wind kicked up, tossing sand like smoke and veiling her from sight. When she rose again, the caravan was gone, nothing but wavering dust on the horizon. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She called out, her voice shrill, desperate, vanishing into the vastness. No one answered. The wind blew. The sun bore down. She walked faster, then ran, kicking up sand, screaming for her uncle, for anyone. But the caravan had already chosen its path, and it did not look back. Amunet's legs trembled with each step. Her lips were cracked, her tongue dry, her satchel slapping against her side. It held the only thing she still had, her father's ink brushes, wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of home. She whispered the names of the gods under her breath, like a chant to keep her mind sharp. Thoth for wisdom, Isis for protection, Anubis for passage. Her feet burned through her soles. The desert offered no shade, no sound, no mercy. By midday, she collapsed behind a dune, body shaking, mouth open but breathless. She curled into herself like a child, shielding her face from the sun with shaking hands. Images of her father drifted into her mind, his smile, the stories he used to tell her at night about stars, about kings, about finding one's destiny even in the darkest places. "If you sleep, you die," she muttered, trying to slap her cheek. But her eyelids were heavy. Her skin was boiling. She was slipping. Then, darkness, coolness, a shadow. When her eyes fluttered open, she saw a face leaning over her. Bronze skin, sun-leathered cheeks, a jagged scar across one brow. He wore no robe of Waset merchants, only a leather tunic, dusty and torn. His eyes studied her, unreadable. "You are either very foolish or very blessed," he said, voice deep like stone grating over stone. "To be lying here, alive." She tried to speak, but her throat scraped like dry reeds. He gave her a water skin. She drank, gasping between gulps, the tears flowing as freely as the water. "They left me," she rasped. He watched her, silent. "Then the desert let you live for a reason," he said. He stood. "Come, before night swallows us both." She stared after him, unsure. But then her fingers tightened around the satchel. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Walk forward, always forward." With trembling legs and a soul cracked but not broken, she rose and followed him into the sand, not knowing who he was, but certain her future had just begun. The man did not speak as they walked. His footsteps were deliberate, his pace steady but not cruel. Amunet followed, her legs aching with each step, the water from the skin still dampening her throat, but not her fear. The dunes rose and fell like golden waves, and she felt as if she were walking through a dream, one that smelled of sweat and dust and held the weight of survival. She tried to ask who he was, but her voice cracked, and he only glanced back briefly, then looked forward again. The silence between them stretched long, filled with questions she dared not ask. He carried a curved blade at his side and a pouch slung over his back. A falcon feather, dark and sharp, was tied to his wrist with faded cord. As the sun dipped lower, the sand turned amber and the air grew cooler. Finally, he stopped at the edge of a narrow ravine, where stone teeth jutted from the sand like a broken jaw. "Here," he said. His voice was low but firm. He motioned to a crevice between the rocks where the wind couldn't reach. "We rest." She slid down beside him, grateful for shade. He handed her a handful of dried figs and a crust of bread. She ate slowly, her stomach knotting not from hunger but from uncertainty. "Why did you help me?" she asked at last, her voice barely above the wind. The man stared at the horizon. "I don't know," he said. "You were not meant to die there. The sand would have taken you, but it didn't." "What's your name?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes narrowing slightly, then said, "I have no name you need to know." The answer stung, but she didn't press. There was something in his voice, an ache beneath the stone, that warned her to leave it be. That night the stars came out, blinking cold and clear in the dark velvet sky. He lit a small fire between the stones and watched it as if it held secrets. Amunet huddled in her robe, trying to find warmth in a world that had turned its back on her. "I was part of a caravan," she said quietly, not sure why she was offering her story to a stranger. "My uncle, he's a merchant. I think he just forgot I was there." The man didn't respond. "My father was a scribe. He died in the plague last year." Still, nothing. She curled into herself. "I used to believe the gods had a plan." The man finally looked at her. "They do," he said. "It just doesn't always look the way we expect." His words settled over her like a strange comfort. That night, Amunet did not dream of Waset or her uncle or even the caravan. She dreamt of firelight and feathers and footsteps leading away from everything she'd known, into something unknown but not empty. And for the first time since her father died, she didn't feel completely alone. By morning, the wind had stilled and the desert stretched out silent and golden. Amunet awoke to the scent of smoke and roasted dates. The man was already awake, crouched by the fire, turning a flat stone with his blade. He had found wild dates during the night, roasted them while she slept, and left her share beside the fire. She watched him with quiet curiosity. Everything about him was measured. His movements, his silence, his glances. He did not waste words, yet nothing about him felt careless. After eating, they moved again, the path turning more jagged, cutting through sandstone ridges that loomed like forgotten gods. As they climbed a narrow trail etched into the rock, Amunet's curiosity overcame her caution. "Where are we going?" she asked, her breath shallow from the climb. The man's voice echoed lightly off the walls. "A place where few go now, but once it was sacred." She blinked. "A temple?" He nodded. "Buried by time, watched over by stone. We'll be safe there for now." The idea of shelter sent a spark of hope through her. She stumbled, her foot slipping on loose gravel. But he caught her wrist with quick strength, steadying her without a word. The sun shifted overhead as they reached the top, revealing a narrow cleft in the cliffside, almost invisible unless one knew to look. The man ducked inside, and she followed, blinking into the dim. The air was cooler, the silence thicker. As her eyes adjusted, she gasped. Columns carved with faded hieroglyphs lined the walls. Dust-covered statues of falcons, lions, and cobras stood frozen in prayer. A faded mural stretched along the far wall, men with jackal heads, a woman with wings, and a child offering lotus flowers to a river of stars. This is ancient," Amunet breathed. "It's beautiful." The man looked around, his expression unreadable. It was built by those who remembered the old ways, before the court of Waset forgot. He moved toward a small altar and touched the edge reverently. "My mother brought me here once. She said the gods could still hear us if we spoke where their names were carved." Amunet stepped closer, awe mingling with sorrow. Why did they abandon places like this? He shrugged. People forgot. Gold became God. Power became prayer. She traced her fingers along a carved line of text. But someone remembered enough to return. He looked at her then, something soft flickering behind his eyes. Yes, someone always remembers. They made camp in the temple's shadow, the man lighting incense from a pouch tied to his belt. That night, as the flame danced, Amunet whispered her father's name to the walls. For the first time, it didn't hurt. The temple held the sound gently, like a cradle. The man listened, silent but present. She didn't know if the gods had truly heard her, but she knew this. There was something holy in being remembered, and even more sacred in being found. The temple walls seemed to breathe with memory, and as the days passed, Amunet felt herself slowly unraveling from the tight knots of fear and loss. She swept the floors with dried palm fronds, cleared sand from the steps, and laid wildflowers at the altar where the stone cobra watched with eternal stillness. The man, still unnamed, ventured out each dawn and returned by dusk with berries, herbs, or small desert game. They spoke little, but their silences grew companionable. He would glance at her sometimes while she tended the shrine, as if trying to read something in her movements. One evening, as twilight bathed the sandstone in deep orange, Amunet found a beetle crawling across the temple floor. Its shell gleamed iridescent blue under the firelight, and she instinctively cupped it in her hand. "A scarab," she murmured. "My father said they carry prayers on their backs." The man looked over, nodding. "They also carry the sun through the underworld. Rebirth, transformation." She watched the beetle climb her finger, then release it outside the entrance, smiling faintly. "Then maybe it's time I stopped being afraid." The man didn't reply, but that night he brought out something he hadn't before, a bundle wrapped in linen. From it, he drew a curved piece of ivory, etched with symbols. He handed it to her. "It's a talisman," he said. "Old. It was my sister's." Amunet turned it over gently in her hand. The shape was of a rising sun flanked by wings. "Why give it to me?" He didn't meet her eyes. "Because I think your path is not over, and because you remind me of someone who never let fear win." The weight of his words settled into her chest. She wore the talisman around her neck, tucking it beneath her robe. That night, as the fire cracked, she dared to ask, "What happened to your sister?" For a long time he didn't speak. Then, in a voice low and heavy, he said, "She died in Waset, not from illness, from cruelty." Amunet's breath caught. "The nobles?" He nodded. "They took what they wanted. When she said no, they made her disappear. The city buried her like a secret." A silence followed, thick and hard. "And that's why you left?" she asked. He stared into the fire. "I was a guard. I served the very men who destroyed her. I carry her shame and my own." "So I disappeared too." Amunet's eyes welled with tears, not just for him, but for every girl like his sister, like herself. She didn't deserve that. "No," he said. "She didn't." That night, Amunet didn't sleep easily. She lay awake, the talisman warm against her skin, the stars watching through the temple's open ceiling. She thought of the scarab, of the desert, of a life rebuilt from loss. She didn't know where her path would go next, but she knew one thing. She would not be silent if the gods gave her voice again. And the desert, it seemed, was finally beginning to listen. By the fifth morning, the wind had changed. Amunet stood at the temple's edge, watching the sun rise blood orange over the dunes. Something in the air felt different, tense, as if the desert was holding its breath. The man emerged from the inner chamber with his satchel slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon before she even spoke. "You feel it too," she said. He nodded. "We're not alone." She had felt it in her bones, in the way the birds had stopped singing, in the silence between gusts of wind. He crouched near the rocks where their footprints ended and traced a fresh mark in the sand with his fingertip. "These weren't here yesterday." Amunet came closer and saw them. Boot prints, wide and deliberate, heading toward the temple from the east. "How many?" she whispered. "3, maybe 4. Men, armed." Her heart pounded. "The ones who left me behind?" "Possible," he said. "Or worse." He rose, brushing the sand from his hands. "We leave at dusk." Amunet didn't argue. She helped pack what little they had. Bundles of herbs, dried meat, a flask of oil, the few possessions she owned. The talisman around her neck felt heavier now, like it was warning her of what was to come. As the sun dipped low, they moved out, leaving the temple behind. Amunet looked back only once, and the stone cobra seemed to stare after her with mournful pride. They crossed the dunes quickly, taking narrow passes and hidden valleys the man had traveled in his years of exile. Amunet stumbled but didn't complain. Her feet bled, her robe tore, but she moved forward, always forward. When they stopped to rest in the shadows of a red rock outcropping, she asked, "Why would anyone follow us?" He hesitated. "Because I know things they want buried." He looked at her then, his face serious. "And because you are a witness now," she swallowed hard. "To what?" "To truth," he said. "And truth is dangerous when it walks free." That night they made no fire. The stars blinked overhead, and Amunet lay awake, gripping her father's satchel with one hand and the talisman with the other. She thought of Waset, of the market where she once smiled at perfume vendors, of the caravan that left her, of the desert that had nearly killed her, and of this man, whose name she still didn't know, but whose pain she now carried alongside her own. She no longer felt like a child forgotten. She felt like something being sharpened by wind and fate, forged in flame and silence. As the wind howled over the rocks, she whispered, "Let them come." The man glanced at her and gave the faintest nod of approval. They both knew, once you walk with ghosts, you stop fearing the living. And as the desert watched, they vanished into the sand, two shadows born of truth, heading toward a future that no longer hid behind others' footsteps. They moved before dawn, the cold air biting through Amunet's robe as they crossed a ravine streaked with moonlight. The man walked ahead, his hand always resting near the hilt of his blade. Amunet followed close, her fingers wrapped tight around the satchel. Every sound, a snapping twig, a shifting stone, set her nerves alight. By midday, the sun was merciless again. They reached a narrow gorge, its high cliffs casting sharp shadows. The man paused, his eyes narrowed. "This is where we stop them," he said. Amunet's breath caught. "Here?" He nodded. "If they're tracking us, they'll pass through this choke point. I've used it before. We can't keep running." Amunet said nothing, only nodded, and helped him set the trap. He showed her where to hide among the rocks and how to signal without sound. Then he took position behind a boulder near the narrowest bend in the gorge. She crouched in the shade, heart thundering in her chest, sweat slicking her back. Hours passed. The sun shifted. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, voices muffled but male. A shadow moved across the sand. The first man appeared, wrapped in desert garb, sword at his side, scanning the gorge. Then a second, then a third. They were armed. Their expressions were hard, their movements calculated. Amunet felt her breath catch as one drew closer, his boots crunching just feet from where she hid. Then, a sharp whistle, a blur of motion. The man she had followed lunged from the rock, striking with brutal precision. His blade met the first attacker's shoulder, and the scream that followed echoed like thunder. The second man rushed him, but he spun, his movements honed like a predator's. Steel clanged. Dust flew. The third man ran toward Amunet's position, eyes wild. Without thinking, she grabbed a rock, rose, and struck him across the temple. He dropped instantly, blood smearing the sand. Her hands shook. She stared at the stone, now red. The man finished the last of the attackers with a final, grunted strike. Silence returned, broken only by their ragged breaths. He approached her, eyes scanning her face. "You're hurt?" She shook her head. "No, I'm—" She looked down at her hands. "I didn't want to kill him." "You didn't," he said gently. "But you fought. That matters." They buried the bodies under loose stone and marked nothing. When they were done, he sat beside her, both of them streaked with dust and blood. "They knew who I was," he said. "That's why they followed. They were from Waset, hired to silence me." Amunet's heart twisted. "Will more come?" "Eventually," he replied. "But we'll be ready." She stared out at the empty desert. Something in her had shifted. Fear, perhaps, now fused with purpose. She wasn't just a forgotten girl anymore. She had defended herself. She had seen death and hadn't crumbled. She met his gaze, her voice steady. "Then let's make sure the next ones never forget our names." And with that, they stood, leaving blood behind and walking toward the rising sun. They traveled north for 3 days, following dry riverbeds and sleeping beneath wind-bent trees. The desert softened, giving way to rocky hills where ancient carvings marked forgotten paths. On the 4th day, They reached a cliffside where the stone was blackened by time, but still bore the marks of chisels, symbols, faces, stories frozen in rock. Amunet traced her fingers over a line of hieroglyphs, the grooves deep and sure. "What is this place?" she asked. The man, wiping sweat from his brow, looked up at the wall. "A sanctuary, a place for names that would otherwise be erased." He stepped closer, pointing to a faded line near the bottom. "My sister's name is there, so is my mother's. They carved them before the soldiers came." Amunet's heart thudded. "You brought me here to remember them?" He turned toward her, his eyes not cold but carved with grief. "No, I brought you here so you could add your own." She blinked. "Why me?" "Because the desert tried to erase you, and you lived. You are not a ghost. You deserve to be known." She didn't speak for a long time. The idea of her name carved into stone, standing alongside those lost to violence and silence. It made her throat tighten. She stepped forward, took the chisel he offered, and knelt before the wall. Her hands trembled, but she pressed the iron to stone and began to carve. She etched carefully, not just her name, but her father's, the scribe who had died forgotten. She wrote the word witness, then paused and added warrior. When she finished, she leaned back and stared at what she had made. It was rough, imperfect, but it was there. The man sat beside her in silence, nodding once. "You've taken root in the sand now. It will not swallow you." That night they camped beneath the cliff. Amunet sat staring at the stars, the talisman warm against her chest, the carvings behind her like the weight of a new legacy. "Tell me your name," she said softly. He hesitated. The fire crackled. Then he said, "Menmaatre." The word felt ancient and powerful. "My mother gave it to me," he added. "It means truth is the beloved of Ra, but no one's used it in years." She repeated it to herself, committing it to memory. "Then I will use it. You are no longer a shadow." He looked at her with something close to gratitude. "And you, Amunet, are no longer lost." The wind carried their words upward, brushing against the stones that now held her name. She felt something shift in the air, a recognition, as if the gods had paused to listen. That night, Amunet slept without fear. In a world where power tried to bury the innocent, she had carved her place with her own hands. And with Menmaatre by her side, she began to believe not just in survival, but in return, in reckoning, and in the quiet power of a name. The journey to the oasis took 2 more days, their path winding through valleys of scorched stone and hills where vultures circled silently overhead. By the time Amunet saw the green blur on the horizon, her legs ached and her lips had cracked again from the wind, but her spirit no longer felt fragile. The oasis was hidden deep between cliffs, guarded by palm trees and a narrow spring that glittered under the sun like melted glass. As they entered, birds scattered and the scent of water filled the air like incense. "This place," she murmured, awestruck. Menmaatre nodded. "Few know of it, fewer find it." They washed in the spring, filling their flasks, wiping away the grime of blood and dust. Amunet stepped into the shallow water, letting it cool her burns. For the first time since being left behind, she smiled. "It feels like we've crossed into a dream. Or out of one," Menmaatre said quietly, kneeling to rinse his blade. After they had eaten, Amunet explored the grove, trailing her fingers across date palms and smooth stones. Her eyes caught something half buried near a cluster of reeds, a satchel, weathered by time, its leather straps snapped. She called Menmaatre over. Inside were scrolls, carefully wrapped but worn, and a clay seal bearing the emblem of Waset's high scribal court. Menmatre's expression darkened. "These are records," he muttered, unrolling one with care. "Confessions, bribes, secrets meant to vanish." Amunet read the names, her eyes widening. These were noblemen, judges, priests, powerful men who had used their authority to destroy and exploit. One name stopped her cold. This one. He was the one who promised to care for my father's estate. My uncle. Menmatre's jaw clenched. "He never intended to protect you. He was part of the machine that devours the weak. They sat beneath the trees, scrolls laid out before them like maps of corruption. "These could bring down half the court," she said, "if anyone believed us." "They won't," he said. "Not unless we show them more than parchment. We show them truth. We show them scars." Amunet nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the scroll in her lap. "We take this to Waset?" "Eventually," he replied. "But not yet. We need allies. Voices louder than whispers." That night, as they built a small fire beside the spring, Amunet stared at the stars and whispered, "You gave me back my voice. Now I'll use it." Menmaatre didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said he had heard. Beneath the moonlight, the oasis no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a beginning. The scrolls would travel with them, and so would the truth. The gods had led her through fire and sand, through loss and silence, and now they had handed her a weapon greater than any blade, the power to reveal what others had buried. She looked at Menmaatre. "We go back," she said. "One day soon." And the wind through the palms whispered, as if in agreement, "Yes, but not as the girl who was left behind. As the woman who returned." They traveled east, skirting the edge of settlements where the poor lived in silence and fear, places where names had no power and memory was a luxury few could afford. Amunet walked with her head high now, the talisman always at her chest, the scrolls wrapped tightly in linen and hidden beneath her robes. Menmaatre moved like a shadow beside her, ever watchful, ever quiet. Word of unrest in Waset had begun to spread. They heard whispers in markets and among wandering traders, disappearances, temple thefts, accusations leveled against nobles, then buried by gold. It was the perfect time, Menmaatre said, to strike not with blades, but with truth. They stopped in small villages along the riverbanks, places where Menmaatre had once served as a guard, and where his name was still remembered by those who trusted him. One by one, he called on old allies, former soldiers, midwives, scribes, even a blind poet who once performed in palace halls. "We are gathering the forgotten," he told Amunet. "Those whose stories were silenced, whose justice was never served." In a crumbling town near the ruins of an old granary, they met Tani, a healer with silver in her braids and fire in her eyes. She had once treated nobles in Waset before being accused of sorcery and cast out. When Amunet told her the truth of the scrolls, Tani placed a hand over her heart and whispered, "It's time they learn we remember." They found a fisherman whose son had vanished after speaking out against a merchant lord. A stonecutter whose wife died when a priest demanded more than worship. A messenger who once delivered death sentences disguised as temple summons. Each had a story, a scar, and a thirst for truth. They gathered in quiet places, reading the scrolls aloud, verifying every name and crime. Amunet sat at the center of them all, her voice steady, her words precise. She no longer shook. She no longer waited for someone to speak for her. In one village, a boy no older than 12 whispered to her, "Are you the girl who survived the desert?" She nodded. He touched the talisman around her neck. "My mother says you walk with the gods." Amunet crouched and smiled gently. "No, little one, I walk with the forgotten, and I won't stop until we are heard." That night, Menmaatre brought her a reed scroll he had inked himself. It held a list of names, those they had met, those who stood ready, those who had fallen. At the bottom, he had written 2 final names, Amunet, witness, Menmaatre, reckoner. She stared at it, her throat tight. "When we enter Waset again," she said, "we will not enter as beggars." "No," he said, "we will enter as truth." The wind carried their words across the water, and the stars above them shone brighter than before. In a land ruled by silence and fear, they were building an army of memory. The desert had not broken her. It had forged her. Now she was returning not as a girl, but as a storm. The gates of Waset rose tall and golden under the early morning sun, their carved falcons and lotus flowers gleaming like eyes watching from the heavens. Amunet stood before them, cloaked in plain linen, but the way she held herself, shoulders firm, gaze unwavering, made even the guards hesitate. Beside her stood Menmaatre, his blade hidden beneath his robe, the talisman of his sister tied to his wrist. Behind them, a quiet procession of villagers, scribes, elders, and exiles stretched into the dust, faces lined with purpose, hands gripping scrolls, not swords. They had not come to beg. They had come to testify. "Are you sure?" Menmaatre asked under his breath. Amunet looked ahead. "I was left behind once. I will not leave the others." The guards questioned them, demanded names, purpose, allegiance. Amunet handed over a sealed scroll bearing the emblem of the ancient scribal court, the one they had found buried in the oasis. "Deliver this to the high priest. If he ignores it, we'll read it ourselves in the plaza." Something in her voice, like flint striking iron, made the guards falter. Word spread faster than fire through dry reeds. Within hours, the plaza filled with citizens, merchants, temple aides, even palace guards drawn by rumor and unrest. The high priest arrived, robes flowing, his face unreadable. Nobles whispered behind gold fans. Amunet stepped forward, scroll in hand, voice ringing out across the stone. "These are the names of the forgotten, the victims, the betrayed, the silenced." She read names, stories, deeds. She held the court accountable with every word, exposing bribes, abuses, disappearances. She named her uncle. She named those who had buried Menmaatre's sister. The crowd listened, stunned. Some wept. Some shouted in anger. Nobles rose to interrupt her, but Menmaatre stepped beside her, drawing his blade just enough for it to catch the sun. "Let her finish," he said. No one moved. When the last scroll was read, Amunet looked out at the silent gathering. "You can deny us. You can pretend we are ghosts, but we are still here, and now you are seen." A murmur rose, a tide turning. The high priest tried to speak, but the people shouted him down. Tani the healer stepped forward, lifting her voice. "We demand reckoning." The poet sang the names Amunet had carved in the cliffside. One by one, the forgotten rose. That night, Waset did not sleep. The palace lit fires not for celebration, but fear. And Amunet, once the girl abandoned in the sand, walked through the city not as a victim, but as a voice. She and Menmaatre stood on the rooftop of the old scribal house, watching the city tremble below. "We didn't just survive," she said. "We rewrote the ending." He looked at her, pride in his eyes, and carved it in stone. The desert had tried to erase her. The powerful had tried to silence her. But in the end, she found her future not in gold or favor, but in truth, and gave it to others like a torch in the dark. And Waset, whether it was ready or not, had begun to burn.